In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, scattered like forgotten jewels across thousands of miles of blue water, lay countless atolls whose names meant nothing to most of the world. Until the autumn of 1943, Tarawa was one such place, a name buried deep within dusty volumes chronicling Pacific exploration and the slow march of colonial expansion. Save for a handful of military strategists hunched over maps in the war rooms of Washington and Tokyo, and the brave souls destined to carry out their ambitious plans, this tiny coral ring and its principal island of Betio remained virtually invisible to history. Then came those 76 stark and bitter hours that would etch Tarawa's name forever into the annals of warfare. When the thunder of guns finally fell silent and the last of the desperate fighting ended, the commander who led the assault could speak with absolute conviction. The heroism displayed by both attackers and defenders in that brief, terrible span deserved to stand alongside the most legendary battles in the entire history of human conflict. Picture, if you will, this strategic dot on the map. Tarawa sits some 2,500 miles southwest of the still-smoking harbour at Pearl Harbor, and 1,300 miles southeast of the formidable Japanese stronghold at Truk, which served as the cornerstone of enemy power in the Central Pacific during those early, desperate years of the Second World War. The atoll's value lay not in its size, for it was minuscule, but in its position, like a chess piece placed with deadly precision on the board of Pacific strategy. This was the crown jewel of the Gilbert Islands, serving as headquarters for the Japanese garrison and home to the island group's only airfield, capable of launching the deadly aircraft that could reach far across the ocean. To the north and west stretched a constellation of Japanese bases throughout the Marshall and Caroline Islands, while to the south and east lay the Allied-held islands that formed a precious lifeline stretching from Hawaii and the continental United States all the way to the embattled territories of the South Pacific, New Zealand, and Australia. Throughout 1942 and the first 6 months of 1943, virtually every Allied operation had been designed with one overriding goal: securing that vital lifeline that connected America to its allies across the Pacific. The great rollback of Japanese forward positions throughout the South and Southwest Pacific had begun in earnest during August of 1942, marked by the seizure of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands and the hard-fought securing of Papua in eastern New Guinea. As 1943 unfolded, the methodical advance continued with relentless precision, each new objective chosen based largely on two critical factors: its suitability as an airbase from which to project power, and its location within the protective range of friendly land-based fighter aircraft. By the waning days of summer, the combined naval and land forces under the command of Vice Admiral William Halsey, the tough-as-nails commander of South Pacific forces, had fought their way to New Georgia in the central Solomon Islands and begun the monumental task of constructing a series of fighter and bomber airfields near the captured base at Munda. Halsey's next target loomed on the horizon: Cape Torokina on the formidable island of Bougainville, where another complex of airfields would be carved from the jungle and coral. Meanwhile, far to the west, General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific forces were maneuvering into position like pieces on a vast chessboard, preparing to strike at Cape Gloucester on the opposite end of the large island of New Britain from the heavily fortified Japanese headquarters at Rabaul. With Cape Gloucester firmly in Allied hands, MacArthur would gain the ability to move his forces safely through the treacherous Dampier Straits that separated New Guinea from New Britain, opening the path for a westward advance along New Guinea's coast toward the ultimate prize, the Philippine Islands. This grand strategy had emerged from the heated debates and passionate arguments that erupted when representatives of Southwest, South, and Central Pacific commands gathered with members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington during March of 1943. The Pacific Military Conference became a crucible where competing visions of victory clashed and merged. MacArthur had arrived with an ambitious plan for operations leading to the capture of the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, but his proposal came with a staggering price tag: 5 additional infantry divisions and 5 more air groups. The harsh reality was that neither the men nor the aircraft were available, forcing the assembled leaders to agree upon a more modest set of objectives that could be achieved with existing resources. The revised plan for 1943 called for MacArthur's forces, operating in coordination with Admiral Halsey's South Pacific Command, to occupy the strategic islands of Woodlark and Kirewina and continue their grueling operations on New Guinea, seize crucial footholds on New Georgia and Bougainville, and establish a presence on western New Britain. While this represented a scaling back of MacArthur's grand vision, it created an unexpected opportunity for another commander whose star was rising in the Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean areas, suddenly found himself with the resources and authorization to advance across the Central Pacific, a route that, in the eyes of Admiral Ernest J. King, the Navy member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, represented the most direct and practical path to the Japanese home islands. Scattered throughout the vast stretches of the Pacific, like stepping stones across an enormous pond, were countless island objectives, each representing a potential air and naval base that could be isolated by swift carrier task forces and captured by specialized amphibious troops. To the Navy officers who studied the strategic situation, the pattern was clear. The war in the Pacific was fundamentally a naval campaign, and America's tremendous and rapidly growing sea power should be exploited to its fullest potential to bring the Japanese Empire to its knees. When the American and British combined Chiefs of Staff convened in Washington during May of 1943, they formally accepted this new strategy. However, the British delegation made their concerns crystal clear. They would strenuously object to any escalation of Pacific operations that might adversely affect the primary drive against Nazi Germany. While the defeat of Germany remained affirmed as the #1 Allied objective and the combined Chiefs of Staff retained veto power over Pacific plans, the future nevertheless looked bright for a significantly greater American effort in the Pacific theater. Yet even with this strategic blessing, the means available in 1943 remained frustratingly limited. Several objectives that had been enthusiastically agreed upon in the conference rooms of Washington were later quietly deferred in favor of less ambitious but more achievable targets. The decision to wrest control of the Gilbert Islands from Japanese hands represented exactly this kind of pragmatic adjustment. Originally, the planners had set their sights on the Marshall Islands as the initial objective in the Central Pacific Drive. These mysterious atolls had been in Japanese hands since the end of the First World War, shrouded in secrecy and speculation. Intelligence about these mystery islands was sparse, but what little information existed suggested that their defenses were formidable and their garrisons substantial. Adding to the challenge was the looming threat posed by the massive naval and air base at Truk, which could launch devastating attacks using both land-based and carrier-based aircraft. This Japanese stronghold was significantly closer to any proposed objectives in the Marshall Islands than it was to the Gilbert Islands, creating a dangerous tactical situation that gave pause to even the most aggressive commanders. An assault on the Marshalls represented a calculated risk of enormous proportions, one that few men bearing the weight of ultimate authority and responsibility were prepared to undertake. Looking back through the lens of history, with the knowledge of what later transpired in the Pacific Campaign, it might seem puzzling to the armchair strategist why Tarawa became necessary as a stepping stone. But no amount of hindsight can fully capture the immense pressures and stark realities that shaped decision-making in those crucial months. The American fleet, while rebuilding and growing stronger each day, was still not the overwhelming force it would later become. The resources available for the ambitious two-pronged attack, MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Thrust and Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive, were far from impressive when measured against the magnitude of the tasks ahead. The decision was made to seize an initial objective in the Central Pacific that could be taken with reasonable confidence using available resources, or so it appeared to the planners at the time. By the middle of 1942, unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, the Japanese had actually reached the absolute limit of their expansion across the Pacific. They had fatally overextended themselves, creating vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited, although this critical weakness was not apparent to American strategists at the time. The Japanese possessions formed what military analysts recognized as a dangerous salient bulging into the southern Pacific, like a spear thrust deep into Allied territory. The strategic solution was elegant in its simplicity. Pinch off this threatening bulge through coordinated offensives in New Britain, the Solomon Islands, and the Gilberts, thereby isolating and neutralizing Japanese forces across a vast front. When the target in the Gilbert Islands was finally selected, all eyes turned to Tarawa, a name that would soon be written in blood and courage across the pages of military history. The success of operations in the Central Pacific would depend heavily upon the exceptional command team that Admiral Nimitz carefully assembled, men whose leadership would prove decisive in the trials ahead. First and foremost among these leaders was the quietly impressive Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man whose calm demeanor masked a brilliant tactical mind. Although Spruance's background lay with the Black Shoe Navy, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that formed the backbone of conventional naval power, he had demonstrated his adaptability by leading a carrier force at the pivotal Battle of Midway. There, he had guided his ships to victory in what was unquestionably the most decisive naval engagement of the war's early phase. Spruance was renowned as a meticulous planner and deep thinker, a leader who inspired profound respect among both his associates and subordinates. He possessed that rare quality of leadership, the ability to bring out the absolute best in those who served under his command. For his principal amphibious commander, Spruance specifically requested and received Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, a man whose reputation preceded him into every planning session. Turner was a driving, aggressive taskmaster, whose typically proper manner and scholarly bespectacled appearance concealed a core of grim determination that burned like iron in a forge. Turner could explode with volcanic fury when circumstances demanded, and he did so frequently enough to earn the memorable nickname Terrible Turner among those who had felt the full force of his wrath. Yet he was, like Spruance, a vastly experienced naval officer who commanded absolute respect, if not always affection. He had successfully led amphibious forces through the grinding campaigns in the Solomon Islands, including the crucial battles at Guadalcanal and New Georgia, giving him precisely the hard-won expertise that would be essential for the new offensive. Equally qualified was Turner's ground force counterpart. For his senior troop commander, Spruance wanted Major General Holland Smith, and Nimitz ensured he was made available. This tough Marine general had led amphibious corps in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, personally training both Army and Marine divisions in the complex tactics and techniques of amphibious assault warfare. Smith had earned his own distinctive nickname, Howling Mad, a play on his initials that reflected his legendary temper. Like Turner, Holland Smith had no patience for incompetence and demanded maximum effort from every man who served under his command. His anger was the stuff of legend, yet his outward appearance remained deceptively mild-mannered. Behind his steel-rimmed glasses, however, his eyes revealed a complete absence of humor when serious work needed to be accomplished. Turner and Holland Smith formed a perfectly matched pair of commanders, their forceful arguments and strong opinions creating a dynamic tension that ultimately strengthened their effectiveness. In many ways, they balanced each other's strengths and weaknesses, and as Spruance had shrewdly anticipated, they invariably worked out their differences between themselves to ensure their missions were accomplished. It would have been fascinating, or perhaps disturbing to more sensitive souls, to have recordings of their top-level planning sessions. Such documents would have enlivened naval history for generations to come, though perhaps at the cost of some reputations. The essential point about these remarkable men, to whom their country owed an enormous debt of gratitude, was their complete professionalism in the finest military sense of that word. They were teachers as well as inspiring leaders, setting the standard for amphibious warfare that would guide the climactic years of Pacific battles. The staff officers they trained and the commanders they developed became the men who would direct an unprecedented parade of victories stretching from Tarawa all the way to the final terrible battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At the outset of the planning phase for the Gilbert Islands operation, which received the code name Operation Galvanic, Admiral Spruance established a command structure that had proven successful at Guadalcanal. The amphibious troops commander, Holland Smith, was initially placed in complete subordination to the amphibious force commander, Turner. However, this arrangement did not survive very long in the face of the Marine general's vigorous objections. Soon, Smith and Turner faced each other as equals at the planning table. Though once operations commenced, Spruance made it crystal clear that Turner would retain final authority over all decisions. The objectives chosen for Operation Galvanic were relatively small in scale, meaning there would be no need until the much larger Mariana Islands campaign for Holland Smith, functioning as a corps commander, to exercise direct control of forces ashore. That responsibility in the Gilbert Islands would fall to two other generals who happened to share the surname Smith. One was Major General Julian Smith, who commanded the veteran 2nd Marine Division, battle-tested warriors who had already proven themselves in the hellish jungles of Guadalcanal. The other was Major General Ralph Smith, who led the untested 27th Infantry Division, a unit that had been formed from New York National Guard personnel and was about to face its first major combat test. Julian Smith's Marines were designated to capture Tarawa, while a reinforced regiment from Ralph Smith's division was assigned to seize Muckin, another strategic atoll within the Gilbert Islands chain. Interestingly, Muckin had not been among the original objectives selected for Operation Galvanic, but it was substituted for a much more challenging target, Nauru Island, located some 380 miles west of Tarawa. After carefully examining their available resources and thoroughly assessing the Japanese threat emanating from both Truk and the Marshall Islands to the north, Spruance, Turner, and Holland Smith unanimously concluded they wanted no part of an assault on Nauru. The prospect of conducting simultaneous amphibious operations, separated by a full day's hard sailing for even the fastest ships, with no possibility for land-based aerial reconnaissance to scout for potential enemy attacks, seemed to Spruance to be extremely unwise and hazardous in the extreme. Years later, Spruance would recall his deliberations with his senior commanders. Kelly Turner and I both discussed this situation with Holland Smith at great length. It appeared to me that Nauru had been useful to the Japanese as a position from which to conduct reconnaissance to the southward, covering the area between the Gilbert and Ellis groups on the east and the Solomon Islands on the west. Once this area was controlled by us, Nauru would not be needed by us, and we could keep it neutralized through constant bombardment. On the other hand, Macon was 100 miles closer to the Marshall Islands, where we were ultimately headed, and it tied in well from the point of view of fleet coverage with an operation against Tarawa. The more we studied the details of capturing Nauru, the more challenging the operation appeared to be, and finally it seemed doubtful that the troops assigned for the mission could actually take it. The transport ships assigned for troop lift were the limiting factor. Macon was an entirely satisfactory objective, and its capture was well within our capabilities. In Holland, Smith's assessment of the strategic situation, he pointed out that it would require an entire division to capture Nauru, which intelligence indicated was heavily defended, and that the potential prize was simply not worth the enormous effort required. The island lacked good landing beaches and possessed only a marginal airfield, while its small lagoon could not accommodate large vessels. Instead, Macon appeared to have a much smaller garrison and a significantly larger lagoon, making it more favorably situated for maintaining control of the Gilbert Islands. The proposed target substitution was presented to Admiral King when he visited Pearl Harbor on September 24th. The Navy's senior officer was quickly convinced, as Nimitz had been before him, and promised to carry the recommendation back to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Once he returned to the capital, King apparently had no difficulty persuading his colleagues to approve the substitution of Mackin for Nauru. One additional objective remained in the Galvanic plan, Apamama Atoll. Reasonably confident that this atoll was only lightly defended, the American commanders anticipated no significant trouble in its capture and viewed it as something of an insurance dividend that would provide them with both an airfield site and an anchorage that could help maintain control throughout the Gilbert Islands. As the Galvanic plan finally evolved into its definitive form, it called for the simultaneous seizure of 3 targets: Tarawa by an understrength division, Mackin by a reinforced regiment, and Apamama by a single company. Tarawa remained, as it had been since the very inception of planning, the primary target and the most challenging objective. The momentous task of conducting the amphibious assault on Betio and securing the remainder of the atoll fell naturally to the 2nd Marine Division. No younger than the 1st Marine Division, since both units had been activated on the same day, February 1st, 1941, the 2nd, had also fought with distinction on Guadalcanal. One of its regiments, the 2nd Marines, had participated in the initial assault as a replacement for a 1st Division regiment that had been reassigned to garrison duties in Samoa. Both of the 2nd Division's other infantry regiments, the 6th and 8th Marines, along with its artillery regiment, the 10th Marines, and its engineer battalion, the 18th Marines, had arrived as reinforcements and seen the grueling Guadalcanal campaign through to its victorious conclusion in February of 1943. The division commander, however, never reached the canal, as Guadalcanal was known to the Marines, since Major General John Marston was senior in rank to the Army General who commanded during the final stages of the operation. Regardless of this sensitive point in inter-service protocol, most units of the 2nd Division shared with the 1st its prestigious award of the Presidential Unit Citation for heroic service in the capture and defense of Guadalcanal. After Tarawa, there would be another such award, this one clearly and unquestionably belonging exclusively to the 2nd Division. From the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, the now battle-tested troops of the 2nd Division sailed across the Pacific to rest and rehabilitation camps scattered in and around Wellington on New Zealand's North Island. The dramatic change of climate and atmosphere proved wonderfully welcome to men who had endured months of tropical warfare. Many of the Marines had contracted malaria and dengue fever, while others suffered from the ubiquitous skin infections collectively known as jungle rot. Wellington, with its refreshingly cool air, its renowned beer, and its notably friendly female population, proved to be exactly the tonic these weary warriors needed. The Americans benefited greatly from the absence of many New Zealand men who were serving in various war zones across Asia, Europe, and Africa. Like the 1st Division, which enjoyed similar experiences in camps near Melbourne, Australia, the 2nd Division's Marines found themselves remarkably popular and unusually successful in matters of the heart. The mutual admiration society that developed between the Marines and the women of New Zealand had an inevitable result. Hundreds of marriages were hastily arranged and celebrated. For the next 2 decades, New Zealand and Australian wives would be far from unusual sights at any gathering of Marine families, living reminders of those brief, intense wartime romances that blossomed in the shadow of uncertainty. While New Zealand, and particularly Wellington, established themselves permanently in the 2nd Division's history and folklore, the underlying purpose of their sojourn there was never forgotten. The division had come to restore its health, absorb desperately needed casualty replacements, and prepare once again for the terrible business of war. A comprehensive and progressive training program was immediately initiated, beginning with small unit tactics before gradually expanding to include maneuvers involving larger and larger formations. In the rolling hills outside Wellington, on makeshift firing ranges, and aboard whatever amphibious craft could be borrowed or requisitioned, the division methodically prepared for its next operation. No Marine was ever permitted to forget his fundamental identity as a sea soldier, that the very reason for his existence was amphibious assault, and the 2nd Division proved no exception to this ironclad rule. Nothing in the entire spectrum of warfare could be more chaotic and confusing than a landing conducted in the face of determined enemy fire. The need for intricate coordination between air and naval fire support, landing craft and transport vessels, troops and heavy weapons, and countless other critical details occurred nowhere else in the realm of military operations. The veterans, among them the real veterans, the senior officers and non-commissioned officers who had participated in the extensive landing exercises of the 1930s, when American amphibious doctrine was hammered out and refined through trial and error, knew with grim certainty that they and the younger men under their command would face a trying ordeal, regardless of what their specific objective might be. The answer to this inevitable promise of confusion in amphibious assault lay in small unit leadership of the highest caliber. The division's watchword became "Keep moving," and every corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, and captain was thoroughly imbued with this fighting spirit by his superiors. If an officer or non-commissioned officer fell in battle, there would always be another trained man ready to step into his place and continue the advance. During the summer of 1943, the average Marine stationed in New Zealand had absolutely no idea where he would be fighting next, and to tell the honest truth, most did not particularly care. After all, one fight was much like another when you had no choice but to fight. However, a select few men were privy to the developing plans, and a heavily guarded war room was established in the Windsor Hotel in Wellington, serving as divisional headquarters where advance planning for the Tarawa operation began in earnest. General Julian Smith and his senior staff members received their first detailed briefing about the target from Admiral Spruance himself, who made the journey to Wellington in early August. One look at the detailed map of Betio and the extensive reef formations surrounding it was sufficient to convince the Marines that navigating across those treacherous reefs would represent their greatest challenge in the upcoming landing. General Smith's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup, immediately requested some of the innovative plastic boats he had heard were being tested for shallow water operations. Unfortunately, none were available for the operation. As far as the Navy was concerned, the landing would have to be conducted using conventional ship's boats, regardless of their limitations. This disappointing news started an entirely new train of thought, one that would prove absolutely essential to the ultimate success of Operation Galvanic. why not employ amphibious tractors officially designated as landing vehicles tracked for the initial assault waves? These remarkable machines could continue operating whether there was adequate water over the reef or not, making them theoretically unstoppable. The landing vehicles tracked had been used previously as supply vehicles in ship-to-shore operations and had proven so valuable in this capacity that the 1st Division harboured strong reservations about their being assigned to any other role. The 2nd Division, however, faced the unique challenge of Tarawa's formidable reefs and was willing to embrace innovation. The model that had been employed at Guadalcanal, designated the Landing Vehicle Tracked 1, was completely unarmoured and therefore highly vulnerable to all types of enemy fire. The division's 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion possessed 100 of these vehicles, though many were approaching the end of their useful operational life. Through the heroic efforts of dedicated mechanics, 75 landing vehicles tracked ones were successfully restored to working condition, but this number fell far short of the requirement to transport the 3 assault waves that General Smith insisted on landing in amphibious tractors. The division launched an intensive campaign to acquire additional tractors, enlisting the influential support of General Holland Smith's 5th Amphibious Corps staff. The Corps, in turn, engaged in prolonged and heated negotiations with Navy officials, who harboured significant reservations not so much about the tactical employment of the tractors, but rather about the logistical means required to transport them to the target area. There were newer armoured models available, designated landing vehicles tracked 2s, sitting on the west coast, but they could not reach New Zealand in time to join the 2nd Division for training and integration. Instead, they would have to rendezvous with their assigned crews at some intermediate point and then proceed to the target aboard slow-moving tank landing ships. These specialized vessels would be forced to depart ahead of the main troop transports in order to arrive at the objective on schedule for the planned assault date. Admiral Turner expressed serious reluctance about risking the premature discovery of these tank landing ships by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft or submarines. He worried that such early disclosure of American intentions might fatally compromise the tactical surprise he desperately wanted to achieve. Despite the significant problems raised by the employment of the landing vehicles tracked, the Marines remained absolutely adamant in their position. They wanted these revolutionary machines, and with Admiral Nimitz's crucial support, they ultimately got them. A provisional company drawn from the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, comprising 10 officers and approximately 300 drivers, crewmen and mechanics, departed New Zealand for Samoa, where they would meet a precious shipment of 50 brand-new tractors that had been dispatched from San Diego aboard the very tank landing ships that would eventually carry them into battle in the Gilbert Islands. Although the newer model bore a strong resemblance to its predecessor, it boasted a significantly more powerful radial engine producing 200 horsepower instead of 146. This increased power enabled it to carry 20 fully equipped assault troops, 2 more than the landing vehicle Tracked 1, and transport them at a marginally higher speed, achieving approximately 4 knots through the water. Most importantly, the landing vehicle Tracked 2 featured armor protection that, while not heavy by tank standards, provided essential defense for the front, sides, and driver's compartment against small arms fire and dangerous shell fragments. Back in New Zealand, determined efforts were made to bring the older landing vehicles Tracked 1s closer to this protective standard by attaching specially manufactured boilerplate, produced by the local Ford Motor Company facility, to the vulnerable cab windows, thereby providing at least some measure of protection for the drivers. While this essential business of equipping the assault waves proceeded throughout most of the preparatory phase, the other complex elements of amphibious planning moved forward simultaneously at all naval and landing force staff levels. Admiral Turner, operating under severe time constraints imposed by the accelerated schedule for Operation Galvanic, relied heavily on high-level conferences at Pearl Harbor to resolve the myriad problems that continuously arose. The face-to-face confrontations between senior commanders, men with the authority to make final decisions on the spot, dramatically accelerated the preparation process, although the inevitable arguments could become quite heated at times. There were seemingly endless problems to be addressed, not the least of which was the geographic separation of the 2nd Marine Division from the rest of the attack force. Julian Smith and key members of his staff flew to Pearl Harbor on October 2nd to present the 2nd Division's detailed scheme of maneuver and to make a compelling case for a preliminary landing on an island adjacent to Betio. The division commander was a courtly gentleman whose entirely unassuming manner and friendly hazel eyes concealed a determined personality that could be displayed with remarkable force during decisive moments. This was unquestionably one of those critical moments. Smith urgently wanted artillery positioned on an offshore island to dramatically improve the survival chances of his Marines during the main assault. Holland Smith, however, was forced to deliver disappointing news. Such a preliminary operation simply could not be authorized. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Japanese possessed the capability to launch coordinated air and submarine attacks within 3 days of the American attack force's arrival in the Gilbert Islands. No time could be spared for secondary landing operations. If such delays occurred, the vulnerable and irreplaceable transport and cargo vessels might be caught lying offshore while still partially loaded with troops and supplies. This crushing disappointment did not completely fill Julian Smith's cup of frustration. Additional bad news delivered at Pearl Harbor caused it to overflow entirely. One of his division's 3 infantry regiments would be held in Corps Reserve, available for employment at either Macon or Tarawa as circumstances might require. Not only would the Betio assault be conducted without the benefit of preliminary artillery support, but it would be undertaken by only 2 regimental combat teams instead of the full divisional strength he had expected. If the preliminary intelligence reports proved accurate, and unfortunately they would, the more than 4,000 Japanese defenders at Tarawa, thoroughly entrenched in carefully prepared defensive positions, would face only twice their number in assault troops. This represented a decidedly unfavorable ratio of attackers to defenders that boded ill for the Marines who would have to storm those beaches. Having presented his arguments and lost on all points except the critical matter of the landing vehicle's tracked twos, Julian Smith nevertheless had his basic scheme of maneuver formally approved by higher headquarters, at his specific request. The 5th Amphibious Corps operation plan was worded so that the 2nd Marine Division was explicitly directed to seize complete control of Betio before attempting to capture any of the other islands within Tarawa Atoll. While Smith was forced to accept this decision by higher authority, he was determined that it should never be considered his personal choice. While the 2nd Division staff group conducted their crucial meetings at Pearl Harbor, they were able to coordinate their detailed plans with the staff of the attack force that would transport, support, and land the Marines at Tarawa. Admiral Turner had chosen to personally lead the Northern Attack Force at Macon, wearing 2 distinct hats as both attack and attack force commander, positioning himself at the point of greatest potential threat should the Japanese launch a major assault from the Marshall Islands or Truk. To command the Southern Attack Force, Rear Admiral Harry Hill was carefully selected for this crucial responsibility. A veteran battleship and escort carrier group commander with extensive experience in South Pacific operations, Hill reported to Admiral Turner on September 18th. This confident and highly impressive officer had exactly 1 month to assemble a competent staff, participate in the intensive planning conferences, and become thoroughly oriented to his challenging assignment. On October 19th, only a few days after Julian Smith's return to Wellington, Admiral Hill followed him to New Zealand. When the Admiral arrived, he was considerably less than pleased with what he discovered regarding his available amphibious shipping. His transport group commander, Captain Herbert Knowles, later described the legion of problems he confronted. Most of these ships arrived lacking full boat complements and woefully lacking in adequate communication facilities. Some of the ships had been diverted to Wellington while still conducting their shakedown operations. My flagship Monrovia had been stripped of virtually everything useful in the way of communication facilities except basic commercial ship radios. Had we not had extra naval personnel and Army communication equipment, both appropriated at the conclusion of the Aleutian operation, we would have been in an even more desperate situation than we already faced. The few ships that had participated in the Aleutians provided officers and men to give at least a minimum level of experienced personnel to the newly arrived vessels. Admiral Hill confronted a different aspect of the same improvised make-do situation that plagued the entire operation. When he arrived in Wellington, approximately 20 civilian yard workers were still aboard his flagship, the battleship Maryland, frantically making necessary alterations for its role in the Tarawa operation. The only available space where the essential communication center could be constructed within the allotted time was on the wing of the flag bridge, which was positioned at approximately the same level as the muzzles of the main battery 16-inch guns when they were elevated to fire at medium ranges. The potential for serious trouble in this arrangement would be fully realized during the actual battle at Tarawa. Although the urgent need for specially equipped amphibious command ships had been recognized and such vessels were being rushed to completion, none would be available in time for Operation Galvanic. Despite these significant challenges, preparations for the coming operation accelerated with increasing intensity. As Knowles's transport ships arrived from various locations throughout the Pacific Theater, they were immediately put to work conducting landing exercises with 2nd Division Marines. Landing craft, vehicle personnel and landing craft mechanized, along with their crews from the boat pool at Wellington, found themselves pressed into service to fill out ships' complements and transport Marines along with their tanks, trucks and artillery pieces in realistic mock assault waves against designated practice beaches. Although the actual target of the division remained a closely guarded secret, the basic scheme of maneuver and the specific units that would conduct the initial landings were now well known throughout the command. The division operation order was completed and distributed on October 25th. The fundamental responsibility for establishing and securing a beachhead on Betio would rest squarely on the shoulders of Combat Team 2, the 2nd Marines, reinforced by the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Combat Team 8, minus the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, would constitute the division reserve, ready to exploit success or reinforce threatened sectors as the tactical situation developed. The potentially frustrating task of serving as 5th Amphibious Corps Reserve fell to Combat Team 6, whose Marines were distinctly unhappy about the prospect of missing what promised to be the main event, regardless of what specific form it might take. The merciless teasing they would endure if they failed to participate in the coming battle was not difficult to imagine, and this prospect weighed heavily on the minds of officers and enlisted men alike. Each of the combat teams had been augmented with carefully selected elements from all the division's supporting units, artillery, tanks, engineers, and service troops attached specifically for the landing operation, with the largest share of reinforcements naturally going to Combat Team 2, which would bear the brunt of the initial assault. As the time to embark for the operation drew steadily closer, wild speculation ran rampant among the junior officers and enlisted men regarding the nature and location of their next mission. Rumors reached epidemic proportions and encompassed at least a dozen potential targets, including, ironically enough, Tarawa itself. However, the high-level security surrounding the operation was genuine and effective. Neither the specific target nor the timing of the attack was widely known even within the division. Elaborate cover plans were carefully formulated to maintain absolute secrecy regarding both the destination and the departure date of the operation. Ostensibly, as the end of October approached, the division's next movement would be nothing more than a full-scale practice landing at Hawke's Bay, located near Wellington, followed by a routine return to the city for continued training and preparation. Sea bags were methodically packed with personal belongings, and treasured green dress uniforms were carefully folded away with hopeful anticipation of their use during Liberty when the ships returned to port. Arrangements were made with the Royal New Zealand Air Force to provide supporting airstrikes for the supposed landing exercise, and coordination was established with the railway system to transport heavy equipment back to Wellington from the designated practice beaches. Finally, when every man and piece of equipment had been loaded aboard ship for what appeared to be a routine training exercise, General Smith and Colonel Shoup drove to meet with the Governor-General and revealed the truth to him. Shoup later recalled that he was the only person in all of New Zealand who actually knew we were headed for battle and would not be returning. Hotels throughout the city were filled with marine clothing and personal belongings. Automobiles were parked in the streets with the expectation of their owner's return, and dates had been arranged for the upcoming weekend. The actual destination of the convoy was Efate in the New Hebrides, where Captain Knowles's transport vessels would join the remainder of Admiral Hill's attack force and conduct a comprehensive rehearsal for the coming landing operation. 3 days after departure, as the ships sailed steadily northward, the vessel's address systems crackled to life with the announcement that Marines of the 3rd Division had successfully landed on Bougainville in the northern Solomon Islands. The news was greeted with resounding cheers by Marines on the decks and in the holds throughout the convoy. The sentiment was entirely genuine. Many of the men had close friends serving in the ranks of the 3rd Division, but even those who did not know anyone personally joined in the celebration. The Marine Corps then, as now, possessed all the fierce esprit de corps of the small, tightly knit organization it had been before the Second World War, and there existed a real and powerful feeling of brotherhood among all Marines, regardless of their specific unit assignments. This general spirit of camaraderie, coupled with natural unit pride and fierce loyalty, would serve the 2nd Division exceptionally well during the terrible ordeal that lay ahead. It would be November 14th before Admiral Hill authorized the disclosure of specific target details to the men aboard ship, but when that moment finally arrived, the information proved both chilling and, as subsequent events would demonstrate, remarkably accurate. The intelligence collection and evaluation effort for Operation Galvanic represented nothing short of outstanding achievement, particularly considering the limited resources and time available. When Tarawa was initially selected as a target, very little reliable information was known about the Gilbert Islands, despite their lengthy possession by the British Empire. The available hydrographic charts and tide tables proved to be little better, and in some disturbing cases no better than those originally produced by the famous Wilkes expedition, which had visited the Central Pacific Islands as far back as 1841. Much more accurate and detailed information about these remote atolls, their dangerous reef systems, navigable passages, protective lagoons, and critical tidal ranges was desperately needed for any hope of success. This vital intelligence would eventually come from 3 primary sources: aerial photography, submarine reconnaissance, and former residents of the Gilbert Islands who had intimate knowledge of local conditions. On September 17th and 18th, aircraft launched from 3 of the Pacific Fleet's most powerful large carriers struck Makin, Tarawa, Apamama, and Nauru in coordinated attacks, simultaneously blasting enemy positions and photographing their defensive installations with meticulous care. The Navy pilots were joined in both phases of these dangerous missions by Boeing B-24 Liberator bombers of the 7th Air Force, operating from recently established forward airfields on Canton and Funafuti Islands. The heavy bombers returned on September 19th, again combining destructive bombing runs with extensive photographic reconnaissance. The thousands of pictures taken during these missions, along with those captured during another combined operation, conducted a month later on October 20th, formed the foundation for much of the detailed intelligence gathered about Tarawa's formidable defenses. However, the aerial camera had its inherent limitations, and even the comprehensive combination of vertical and oblique photographs could answer only some of the countless questions that continued to plague the meticulous planners. Much more valuable information was obtained during an extraordinarily daring cruise conducted by the submarine Nautilus, which spent nearly 3 harrowing weeks during September carefully navigating through the Gilbert Islands. The submarine methodically logged detailed information about the prevailing tides and ocean currents at each of the designated atoll objectives. Using a specially fabricated rig attached to its periscope that held one of the officers' personal cameras, none of the officially issued cameras functioned properly and permitted the sequence timing necessary for stereo overlap. Nautilus captured a series of remarkable photographs that provided crystal-clear, panoramic views of all the potential targets. These invaluable photographs, along with the critical hydrographic information gathered during the perilous mission, reached Pearl Harbor on October 7th, providing planners with their first detailed look at what they would be facing. To supplement the crucial intelligence gathered by aircraft and submarine, Admiral Turner assembled what he fondly called his Foreign Legion, a remarkable group of 16 men who possessed intimate familiarity with the islands, all of whom had traveled extensively, or actually resided in the Gilbert Islands before the arrival of Japanese forces had compelled them to flee southward to more friendly waters. While all these knowledgeable islanders generously shared their expertise with Turner's amphibious planning staff, those who knew Tarawa best were specifically sent to Wellington to work directly with the 2nd Marine Division staff. The most sensitive and critical question they were called upon to answer concerned the depth of water that would flow over the reef on the morning of November 20th, 1943, the day designated for the assault. The opinions of these experienced men varied considerably, and the existing tide tables provided conflicting information. There seemed to be no reliable way of resolving this crucial disagreement. Some of the islanders expressed confidence that on the 20th, during the 3rd quarter of the moon, there would be as much as 5 feet of neap tide covering the reef. Neap tides, characterized by minimal ebb and flow, typically produce the lowest high tides of the lunar cycle. Other islanders, principally Major FLG, Holland, a New Zealander who had actually lived at Tarawa for an extended period, were considerably less certain of this optimistic assessment, although the tide tables available to them seemed to support it. Holland pointed out with characteristic caution that during neap tide periods at Tarawa, the tides had frequently behaved in irregular and unpredictable patterns, and perhaps as little as 3 feet of water might cover the treacherous reef. The Marines' intense interest in water depth centered entirely on the critical question of whether conventional landing craft would be able to make it over the reef to reach the beaches. The majority of the assault and supporting troops of the division would have to land in standard ship's boats, following the initial waves of landing vehicles tracked, and most of the crucial follow-on flow of heavy weapons, vehicles, ammunition, fresh water, and rations would also arrive by conventional boat. A fully loaded landing craft vehicle personnel drew 3½ feet of water, and if it ran aground at the reef's edge or somewhere during its approach to shore, its passengers would be forced to abandon the craft and wade to the beach, carrying, pushing, or dragging their essential weapons and equipment through the water with them. As Colonel Merritt Edson, the 2nd Division's Chief of Staff, would later observe with characteristic understatement, "We had a pretty slim margin anyway. Even if we had 3½ to 4½ feet of water, the average 4 feet we expected, that gave us very little edge for our landing craft vehicle personnel and practically no safety margin for the landing craft mechanized that were loaded with tanks. Faced with the terrible responsibility of commanding an amphibious assault landing against a determined and well-prepared enemy, General Julian Smith had absolutely no intention of deluding the men who would have to storm Betio's defended beaches. At every briefing session, Marines assigned to the 4th and subsequent landing waves were explicitly warned that they might very well have to wade ashore through several hundred yards of water, and that the tides might not provide sufficient depth to float their boats over the reef. Tank commanders made careful preparations to have trained guides wade ahead of their lumbering, half-blind armored vehicles to lead them safely to the beaches, and artillery officers reminded the crews of their 75mm pack howitzers that they could very well find themselves manually hauling their weapons and ammunition through the surf to reach their assigned positions. The reef formations themselves represented formidable natural obstacles, stretching from 600 to 1100 yards outward from Betio's shores. The island itself was barely wider at any point than the narrowest section of the reef shelf, with an overall shape somewhat resembling a bird in flight, stretching approximately 2½ miles from its broader head on the western end to a narrow, tapering tail extending eastward. The bird's legs were formed by a substantial wooden pier that reached out from the northern shore all the way to the edge of the reef, providing the Japanese with their primary means of unloading supplies and reinforcements. On the southern, or ocean side of the island, the barrier reef lay well away from the shore and was constantly pounded by heavy ocean swells that made any landing attempt extremely hazardous. The waters surrounding the western headland, swept by strong and irregular currents, contained both barrier and fringing reef formations that created additional navigational challenges. The selection of suitable landing beaches had therefore narrowed dramatically to the northern shore, a choice reinforced by the realization that the island itself would provide some shelter for ships anchored in the lagoon during foul weather, and by the fact that aerial photographs clearly showed the heaviest concentration of enemy defensive positions along the ocean-facing shores. Extensive minefields were clearly visible on the southern and western beaches in the reconnaissance photographs, but relatively few mines were detected on the lagoon side, which the Japanese were obviously using as their primary entry point for construction materials and military supplies. It was evident that the enemy intended to seal every approach to Betio's shores against potential invaders, but this massive defensive construction project was still in progress when the American photographic aircraft captured their invaluable record. The geographical layout of Tarawa Atoll strongly encouraged the Americans to plan their assault from the lagoon side. The atoll formed a rough triangular shape, measuring 22 miles in length with a 12½ mile base at its southern end, where Betio occupied the westernmost position. The only navigable passage into the protected lagoon was a mile-wide break in the western barrier reef, located 3½ miles northwest of Betio's northern corner. Reconnaissance revealed little evidence of significant enemy defensive preparations or military activity anywhere else within Tarawa Atoll, except on Betio itself, and there appeared to be minimal risk from Japanese artillery positioned on any of the numerous tiny islets and narrow coral islands that dotted the reef formations on the southern and eastern sides of the lagoon. American planners could therefore count on moving into the lagoon with their assault waves and some escort vessels, concentrating their entire effort against Betio without worrying about threats from other directions. However, while there might be no enemy guns on the surrounding islands, there was certainly no shortage of them on the primary target. Photo interpreters, meticulously examining every square millimeter of the prints they received of Betio, compiled a truly formidable inventory of enemy weapons. Their careful analysis revealed at least 8 large coast defense guns, including 4 massive 8-inch naval rifles that could destroy any ship within their considerable range. The 2nd Division intelligence officers determined the size of these cannon by mathematically relating their dimensions to the known measurements of wrecked aircraft visible on Betio's airfield. In addition to these primary weapons, the photographs revealed 25 heavy and medium anti-aircraft guns and carefully constructed emplacements for 82 anti-boat guns and 52 machine gun positions. An actual post-battle count of major Japanese weapons would later document 20 large cannon ranging in size from 80 mm to 8 inches, 25 field pieces of 37 mm, 70 mm, and 75 mm caliber, 7 light tanks mounting 37 mm guns, and 31 machine guns of 18 mm caliber. No accurate count could ever be made of the numerous light 7.7 mm machine guns that the defenders had positioned throughout their defensive network, as most of these weapons were either completely destroyed or buried beneath the ruins of enemy emplacements during the fierce fighting that followed. One notable and thankful absence from this impressive arsenal was mortars. If the Japanese possessed any significant number of these deadly indirect fire weapons on Betio, they had somehow escaped detection by even the most thorough intelligence analysis. A stroke of analytical genius, or perhaps just extraordinary luck, enabled the intelligence officers to estimate the size of Tarawa's garrison with remarkable accuracy. On one exceptionally clear photograph of Betio, one that Lieutenant Colonel Shoup would later describe as the best single aerial photograph taken during the entire Second World War, the interpreters spotted the shoreline latrines used by the Japanese garrison. The photographic detail was sharp enough to identify several better constructed facilities that were presumably reserved for officer use. By carefully estimating how many men the Japanese would logically assign to each latrine facility, the Americans calculated a garrison strength that came remarkably close to the actual figure of 4,836 men. From order of battle intelligence provided by 5th Amphibious Corps, divisional officers were reasonably confident that most, if not all, of the enemy forces were naval troops, and that a significant number of them were construction laborers of questionable combat value. There was little doubt, however, about the proven combat effectiveness of the enemy naval infantry and artillery crews, often incorrectly labeled by combat correspondents as Japanese Marines. The men of the Special Naval Landing Forces had demonstrated their capabilities in numerous earlier battles, proving themselves to be versatile, thoroughly trained, and extraordinarily tenacious fighters. The Special Naval Landing Force units were typically equipped specifically for the missions they were assigned, and in defensive situations had established reputations for being heavily armed with crew-served weapons in impressive numbers. The man charged with the defense of the Gilbert Islands was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding the 3rd Special Base Force with his headquarters established on Betio. This unit, which numbered 1,122 men at Tarawa, had previously been known as the 6th Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, incorporating the name of its home naval base in Japan into its official designation. Also stationed at Tarawa under Shibasaki's command was the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force with 1,497 men, the 111th Construction Unit with 1,247 laborers, and 970 men from a 4th Fleet Construction Department detachment. The construction troops, the majority of whom were Korean conscripts, had received no combat training, and the Koreans in particular displayed no enthusiasm whatsoever for battle. The Makin Atoll garrison represented a smaller version of the force at Tarawa, with 284 Special Naval Landing Force troops, approximately 100 aviation personnel, and 446 construction laborers. On the tiny atoll of Apamama, there were only 23 Japanese defenders of any description. While Admiral Shibasaki could realistically count only about 3,000 of his men at Tarawa as truly combat effective, he extracted maximum value from the remainder of his command. The construction labourers contributed as much to the defence of Betio as the elite special naval landing forces through their tireless efforts to build and improve the island's fortifications. The Army's official history of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns would later describe Tarawa as the most heavily defended atoll that would ever be invaded by Allied forces throughout the entire Pacific War. This authoritative assessment added the sobering opinion that, with the possible exception of the bloody beaches at Iwo Jima, Betio's shores were better protected against an amphibious landing force than any encountered in any theatre of war during the Second World War. There were compelling reasons for this ominous evaluation. Betio had been transformed into a veritable fortress through months of intensive construction efforts. All along the island's vulnerable shores stretched an interconnected series of strongpoints, concrete pillboxes, and carefully positioned gun emplacements with meticulously integrated fields of fire that eliminated any possibility of blindside approaches. The majority of these defensive positions were completely covered, and many featured an inner core of heavily reinforced concrete that could withstand direct hits from the largest naval guns. Most were protected by alternating thick layers of resilient coconut logs and packed coral sand. These ingeniously designed absorbent and protective layers proved so effective that they could survive direct hits from bombs and heavy artillery shells that would have destroyed conventional fortifications. There was simply no way to eliminate these defensive positions except by systematically annihilating every man who manned them. In addition to the major weapons emplacements, there were scores of supporting rifle pits, interconnected trenches, and machine gun nests, all carefully protected and positioned so their interlocking fires could sweep the beaches and the waters beyond with devastating effect. Surrounding the entire island, approximately 50 to 100 yards offshore, was an elaborate double-apron barbed wire fence designed to entangle landing craft and swimming attackers. Massive concrete tetrahedrons studded the reef formations like giant caltrops, and additional barbed wire obstacles were strategically placed along the beaches to channel attacking troops directly into the carefully prepared fire zones of the waiting weapons emplacements. A formidable log barricade reinforced the beach defences along the southern shore, effectively converting it into a 20-foot-wide death trap that could be completely blanketed by concentrated small arms fire from multiple directions. The beaches represented the focal points of the entire Japanese defensive strategy. The naval troops had been explicitly ordered to knock out the landing boats with mountain gunfire, tank guns, and infantry guns, then concentrate all available fires on the enemy's landing point and destroy him at the water's edge. This all-or-nothing philosophy of stopping any invasion attempt at the beaches was so thoroughly embraced that there was no cohesive defensive system prepared for the island's interior. Aircraft revetments offered some limited cover to defenders, and there were scattered air raid shelters and trenches that possessed some defensive potential, but these were not integrated into any comprehensive plan. Huge reinforced concrete bunkers, many so thoroughly covered with sand that they resembled small hills rising from the coral, were scattered throughout the runway and taxi strip areas of the airfield. These massive structures housed Japanese command posts, vital communications centers, and ammunition storage areas, and they had been constructed to be virtually impervious to naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. However formidable these bunkers appeared, they had been built primarily for protection rather than active fighting positions. Once the outer belt of coastal defences was breached by attacking forces, these bunkers became vulnerable and could be isolated and neutralised, even though combat engineers would find it nearly impossible to actually destroy them with conventional explosives. The underlying reason for Betio's elaborate fortifications and substantial garrison was not merely a gesture of defiance or determination. Enemy strategists had correctly calculated that the Americans would inevitably attempt an advance across the Central Pacific, and that the logical objectives would be islands equipped with operational airfields. If these strategic islands were strongly defended and held for extended periods, the American amphibious vessels and their supporting warships would be forced to remain in the target area long enough for Japanese aircraft and submarines to converge on them from multiple directions and launch coordinated attacks. Then the main enemy fleet would sortie from its primary base at Truk and deliver the final blow to destroy the entire invasion force. The Gilbert Islands were intended to serve as part of an outer defensive barrier stretching from the Marshall Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago, made virtually impregnable through a deadly combination of fanatically fighting garrisons and coordinated air and sea counterattacks launched from multiple bases. This represented the essence of Japanese defensive strategy, but the Americans would strike too soon, and with too much concentrated power for this plan to have any realistic chance of success. Admiral Shibasaki remained absolutely confident of his ability to fulfill his crucial role in this grand defensive scheme. Regardless of what might go wrong elsewhere in the Pacific, Tarawa would be held at all costs. According to a prisoner captured on the island after the battle, the admiral had boasted that the Americans could not take Betio with 1,000,000 men fighting for 100 years. Approximately 55% of the men in the 2nd Marine Division were combat veterans who had proven themselves under fire, but very few of them had actually participated in an opposed amphibious landing against a defended beach. All the Marines, like every member of the Corps, possessed a basic familiarity with amphibious techniques, various types of landing craft, the realities of shipboard life as experienced aboard crowded transports, and most had participated in at least a few practice landings during their training in New Zealand. The fundamental purpose of the stopover at Ep.1 was to rehearse the complete landing operation planned for Tarawa, work out the inevitable problems and coordination difficulties in the landing plans, and familiarize the amphibian tractor and boat crews, assault troops, and ships companies with the complex procedures for disembarkation, boat-to-tractor transfers, and assault wave formation. The designated attack troops conducted their practice landings at Malay Bay, while the fire support ships simulated their bombardment procedures at Pango Point. The fast aircraft carriers that would provide crucial air support on the actual assault day were committed to other preparatory strikes throughout the Pacific and could not participate in the rehearsal with their aircraft. A second comprehensive rehearsal followed immediately after a detailed critique of the problems identified during the first exercise, with troops again landing at Malay Bay, while the supporting warships conducted an actual shore bombardment against Eradaku Island, providing realistic training for both the naval gunners and the Marines who would have to coordinate with this fire support. It was during this critical pause at Ep.1 that the designated Assault Combat Team commander, Colonel William Marshall, became seriously ill. Unable to risk Marshall's health failing during the actual operation, General Julian Smith was forced to name a replacement commander with virtually no time for transition or additional preparation. He chose the man most thoroughly familiar with the division's detailed plans, his own operations officer, who was immediately promoted to the appropriate rank for his new responsibilities. Colonel Shoup, after assuming command of the 2nd Marines, brought in his own executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dixon Gowen, to assist in the transition. Since Shoup had worked in the same building and shared meals at the same officers' mess at Camp Paekakariki with the 2nd Marines officers throughout the planning period, he was already well known to the men he would lead into battle. The new regimental commander was a thick-set, bull-necked man with an uncompromisingly direct attitude and well-known preferences for poker games and colourful profanity, and he would prove himself to be exactly the right leader for the terrible fight that lay ahead. While Admiral Hill's Southern Attack Force Task Force 52 conducted its vital rehearsals in the New Hebrides, a coordinated series of preliminary operations was already underway, carefully designed to isolate the target islands and systematically devastate their defences before the main assault. New forward bases had been established at Nanumea and Nukufetau atolls in the Ellis Islands and at Baker Island to the east of the Gilbert Islands. These strategic positions had been occupied during August and September, and operational airfields were functioning at all three locations by October 9th, providing platforms for sustained air attacks against Japanese positions. Heavy bombers of the 7th Air Force had been striking targets throughout the Gilbert Islands and southern Marshall Islands intermittently throughout the summer and early fall, but these attacks had been conducted in a relatively sporadic fashion. On November 18th, they began a systematic and intensive attack pattern, with Japanese airfields designated as their primary targets, designed to eliminate enemy air power before the invasion commenced. Navy land-based bombers and long-range seaplanes maintained the pressure through coordinated night strikes against targets throughout the Gilbert Islands, ensuring that Japanese defenders would receive no rest, and that any attempts to reinforce or resupply the garrisons would be severely hampered. Japanese aircraft throughout the region fell victim to fighters operating from the powerful aircraft carriers of Rear Admiral Charles A. Pownall's Task Force 50, which struck Nauru with devastating effect on November 18th, and followed up by hitting Jaluit and Meal in the Marshall Islands on the 19th. These preliminary attacks appeared to be highly successful in isolating the target area from outside support, but the most decisive victory had actually been achieved several weeks earlier in the Southwest Pacific Theater in the skies over the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul on New Britain. When American forces had attacked Bougainville, the Japanese command had desperately emptied their aircraft carriers at Truk, sending virtually every available plane and pilot southward to strike the American invasion force in what they hoped would be a decisive counterattack. In a series of wild and chaotic aerial battles that raged for days, Army Air Forces and Navy fighter pilots systematically destroyed the cream of Japanese carrier aviation. When Operation Galvanic was finally launched, the carefully planned enemy strategy to attack the American amphibious force and its covering ships when they struck the Gilbert Islands had been rendered completely useless. Without their experienced pilots and aircraft, the Japanese carriers had been reduced to nothing more than large, vulnerable targets floating uselessly at their anchorages. They could not be risked in any operation against Pownall's powerful carrier force, and without carrier-based air cover, the enemy's surface fleet of battleships and cruisers was equally helpless against coordinated air attacks. Although Admiral Spruance had no way of knowing the full extent of Japanese losses at the time, the enemy fleet had been effectively eliminated as a threat to the success of Operation Galvanic. There would still be submarine attacks to contend with, and individual aircraft might still pose some danger, but these scattered threats would have no practical effect on the ultimate course of the operation or its successful outcome. On November 18th, Task Force 52 departed from F8, following in the wake of the slower-moving tank landing ship group that was transporting the precious landing vehicles Tracked 2s to the Tarawa operation. At sea on the 17th, Admiral Hill's ships had rendezvoused with Admiral Turner's vessels, which had sailed directly from Pearl Harbor, and the two powerful attack forces proceeded along parallel courses toward their destiny in the Gilbert Islands. As the Navy had feared might happen, the tank landing ships, advancing ahead of the main convoys, in this case, those carrying the landing vehicles, Tracked 2s designated for the make-in landing, were spotted by a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft on the 18th. Several enemy bombers appeared at dusk, clearly intent on attacking the vulnerable transports, but carrier-based fighter planes shot down one of the attackers, and the remainder quickly disappeared into the gathering darkness. On the following day, a large patrol bomber was detected, approaching the convoy, and was swiftly destroyed before it could report the fleet's position and composition. However, there were no massive waves of enemy aircraft roaring in to attack the American ships as many had feared. If the Japanese High Command knew that a major attack was imminent, there appeared to be little they could do to prevent it until their island garrisons were called upon to play their crucial defensive role. Aboard the crowded transports steadily approaching their target, the Marines finally learned their destination and the nature of their mission. Sealed packets containing detailed maps, reconnaissance photographs, and operational orders were ceremoniously opened on all ships, and small groups of intense, attentive men gathered in the sweltering equatorial heat to listen carefully to briefings from their officers about what lay ahead. The Marines were thoroughly informed about the elaborate plans for preliminary bombardment by carrier-based aircraft, and about the fact that heavy cruisers from the fast carrier force would slam 8-inch shells into Betio for 2 solid hours on the day before the landing, specifically targeting the enemy's most dangerous heavy guns. They listened intently to detailed explanations of the comprehensive scheme for preliminary air and naval gunfire bombardment, and to many of the assembled Marines, it all appeared impressive and reassuring. Optimism seized some of the enlisted men and junior officers. Betio looked incredibly small on the maps and photographs, and the sheer weight of metal and high explosives that would hammer the tiny island before the first Marine ever set foot on its beaches seemed overwhelming. However, most of the seasoned Marines remained deeply skeptical of such promises. They had fought the Japanese before in other campaigns, and knew from bitter experience that these determined enemies would fight to the death, regardless of how hopeless the odds might appear to outside observers. More importantly, the odds were not as heavily weighted in favor of the attackers as they should have been for reasonable prospects of success. On the crowded decks of the convoy's ships, bayonets and fighting knives were methodically honed to razor sharpness. Personal equipment was checked and rechecked with obsessive care, and when small arms ammunition was finally issued to the assault troops, experienced men carefully examined each individual round, clip, magazine, and belt to ensure that everything functioned perfectly when their lives depended on it. Rifles were stripped down and cleaned with meticulous attention to detail, given a light coating of preservative oil, and then cleaned again and re-oiled to ensure perfect operation under combat conditions. There was an unmistakable air of nervous tension pervading the entire convoy. Despite the quiet groups of half-naked card players seeking distraction, the solitary men absorbed in paperback novels, and the hundreds who simply slept on the steel decks or stared silently out to sea, apparently trying to ignore the approaching ordeal. Religious services throughout the convoy were exceptionally well attended, and the congregations displayed a seriousness and intensity that spoke volumes about what every man understood lay ahead. Characteristically, Admiral Spruance, who accompanied the attack force aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, chose to leave the traditional last-minute speeches and exhortations to his subordinate commanders. These inspirational messages were expected by the troops, well-intentioned by their commanders, and genuinely appreciated by men facing the prospect of combat. Admiral Turner's message to the entire attack force, read aloud on the day before the landing to all hands throughout the convoy, reminded the sailors and Marines of the close cooperation between all arms and services, the spirit of loyalty to each other, and the determination to succeed displayed by veteran and untried personnel alike, which gave him complete confidence that we will never stop until we have achieved total success. In a similar spirit, General Smith addressed his Marines with words that acknowledged their selection for this crucial mission. The division had been especially chosen by the High Command for the attack on Tarawa because of its proven battle experience and demonstrated combat efficiency. He prophetically stated that what they accomplished there would set the standard for all future operations throughout the Central Pacific area. He concluded his message with two sentences that obviously touched the quietly listening men throughout the convoy. "Your success will add new laurels to the already glorious tradition of our corps. Good luck, and God bless you all." During the early morning hours of the designated assault day, the carefully coordinated scheme of attack called for the transport vessels to move into a predetermined area, approximately 6 miles from the chosen landing beaches, positioned just outside the lagoon entrance. The landing vehicles, tracked ones, carried aboard 10 different ships, would then be lowered into the water and maneuver to positions alongside 3 specific transports carrying the Marines of Combat Team 2. As soon as the assault troops of the first wave had climbed down the heavy cargo nets and loaded into their assigned amphibian tractors, the second and third waves would follow the same procedure and load into conventional landing craft vehicle personnel. These boats would then proceed to a designated rendezvous point to meet the landing vehicles' tracked twos, which by that time would have been disgorged from their tank landing ships and made ready for action. As the amphibian tractors moved toward the wave assembly area at dawn on the assault day, the landing craft of the follow-up waves would assemble northwest of the lagoon passage, while Marines of the fourth and subsequent waves climbed into their designated boats and helped load the heavy equipment and weapons that would be essential for success once the beachhead was secured. The landing ship Dock Ashland, carrying a full company of medium tanks that would provide crucial fire support, would flood its internal well deck to enable its landing craft mechanized cargo to pass through its stern gate and join the growing assembly of assault vessels. While these complex loading and assembly operations proceeded with clockwork precision, specialized minesweepers would clear the treacherous reef passage of any underwater obstacles, mark a safe channel for the following vessels, and then take up their assigned position on the line of departure, where the long columns of tractors and boats would execute their crucial right turn toward the defended beaches. Simultaneously with all these preparations, and precisely as dawn broke over the target, aircraft launched from the powerful carriers of the supporting task force were scheduled to open the attack on Betio with 30 minutes of intensive strafing and bombing runs, designed to suppress enemy defensive fires during the crucial final approach. As soon as the carrier aircraft completed their mission and cleared the target area, the massive fire support fleet, 3 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 9 destroyers would commence a devastating 2-hour bombardment of unprecedented intensity. The first 75 minutes of this barrage were specifically allocated to neutralizing enemy defensive positions and systematically destroying the most dangerous coast defense guns, while the final 45 minutes would deliver increasingly heavy concentrations of destructive fire designed to saturate predetermined target areas with high explosives. Then, As the assault waves approached within final striking distance of the beaches, the carrier planes would return for one last 5-minute strike, specifically directed against beach defensive positions that might threaten the landing forces during their most vulnerable moments. Most of the fire support ships would be positioned in the open ocean to the west of Betio, firing along the long axis of the island to achieve maximum destructive effect, since shells approaching from the south might ricochet dangerously into the boat lanes used by the assault forces. However, 2 destroyers were specifically assigned to follow the minesweepers through the lagoon passage and take up close support positions, where they could provide direct fire support for the landing waves as they approached the beaches. The comprehensive preliminary bombardment that had been so carefully planned exceeded in scope and intensity anything that had previously been attempted in the Pacific theater. Some optimistic naval officers were privately convinced that there would be virtually nothing left alive on the tiny island when the Marines finally landed and began their advance inland. However, Captain Knowles, who ranked among the most experienced amphibious commanders in the entire attack force, held decidedly different views and had expressed them forcefully during the planning conferences. He vividly recalled that in the Solomon Islands campaign, where he had successfully landed the 1st Parachute Battalion in their assault against the heavily defended island of Gavutu, from daylight until noon, this small island had been subjected to repeated bombing attacks and continuous bombardment by cruisers and destroyers. He pointed out with emphasis that the results had been most disappointing in terms of actually reducing enemy resistance. He feared, with good reason as events would prove, that the same pattern would be repeated at Tarawa. On the morning of November 20th, the moon rose shortly before 1 o'clock, and the covering warships glided silently into their assigned positions slightly over 1 hour later. The low-lying atoll was clearly silhouetted against the horizon, as the transport vessels hove to at approximately 3:55 in the morning, and immediately began the complex process of unloading Combat Team 2 Marines into their assault craft. Admiral Hill quickly discovered that his ships, fighting against a persistent 2-knot current, were steadily drifting southward into an area where they would interfere with the fields of fire of some vessels in his gunfire support group. At 4:31 in the morning, the Admiral ordered the transports to cease their unloading operations immediately and reposition themselves in their proper stations. As the massive ships shifted position during the following 30 minutes, some of their trailing landing craft became separated in the darkness and had to be located and rounded up, thereby causing significant delays in the transfer of troops to amphibian tractors and the subsequent formation of the critical assault waves. Approximately 10 minutes after Admiral Hill had issued orders for the transports to move northward to their correct positions, a brilliant red star cluster suddenly shot up through the darkness and burst dramatically over the eastern end of Betio. For several tense moments, nothing happened, and then at 5 minutes past 7 o'clock, Japanese shore batteries opened fire with thunderous roars that shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The enormous splashes from near misses were clearly visible even in the dim light, indicating unmistakably that the enemy still possessed his most dangerous heavy coast defense guns, despite all the efforts of previous bombing and cruiser attacks to eliminate them. Led by the massive 16-inch guns of the battleship Maryland, the heavy support ships immediately began firing in reply, seeking out the bright muzzle flashes of the enemy weapons with their own devastating salvos. After Maryland's 5th salvo, a spectacular explosion ashore appeared to signal the destruction of at least one Japanese 8-inch gun position, and the island fell temporarily quiet, as the relentless pounding by American battleships and cruisers continued without pause. A thick pall of smoke and dust gradually obscured the target, broken occasionally by towering pillars of flame when ammunition storage areas or fuel supplies were struck and detonated. Partly to allow this obscuring cloud to settle and clear the way for a scheduled strike by carrier aircraft, and partly to assess the damage already inflicted, the attack force commander signaled cease firing at 5:42 in the morning. The Japanese defenders immediately took advantage of this temporary pause in the devastating rain of high explosives to open fire once again, this time directing their attention toward the transport vessels, which were now clearly visible in the steadily growing dawn light. Several near misses came uncomfortably close to the vital ships. 3 American sailors were wounded by shell fragments that showered the decks of their transport. As soon as the 4th wave of Marines had been successfully transferred into their designated boats, the vulnerable transports sailed northward out of the effective range of enemy artillery. With what could be considered pardonable exaggeration, the transport group commander noted in his official report that for approximately 30 minutes, the enemy had been completely free to conduct what amounted to target practice against the American transports without any interference whatsoever from either air or naval bombardment. The systematic preparation of Betio continued as planned, but the brief exchange of fire had already demonstrated that the Japanese garrison remained very much alive and capable of putting up fierce resistance. The preliminary bombardment had been impressive in its scope and intensity, but it had not achieved the complete neutralization of enemy defenses that some optimistic planners had hoped for. As the morning progressed and the assault waves formed up for their approach to the beaches, every Marine aboard those crowded landing craft understood that they were about to face one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire Pacific. The 76 hours that would follow would indeed prove to be among the most bitter and costly in the long history of the Corps, but they would also demonstrate the incredible courage and determination that would carry American forces across the Pacific to ultimate victory. The story of Tarawa was about to be written in blood and sacrifice on the coral sands of a tiny atoll that few had ever heard of before November 20th, 1943. When the guns finally fell silent and the last defender had been killed or captured, the lessons learned in those 76 terrible hours would reshape the entire conduct of amphibious warfare and pave the way for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring the Pacific War to its conclusion on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Marines climbing down into their landing craft that morning could not know that they were about to participate in one of the pivotal battles of the Second World War, but they understood with crystal clarity that they faced a dangerous and determined enemy who would fight to the death for every yard of coral sand. They had been trained for this moment. They had prepared as thoroughly as time and circumstances permitted, and now they would have to prove themselves worthy of the proud traditions of the Corps in the most demanding test any of them had ever faced. The assault waves began their final approach toward the beaches of Betio as the supporting warships resumed their thunderous bombardment, and the fate of Operation Galvanic hung in the balance. What happened in the next 76 hours would determine not only the success or failure of this particular operation, but would also influence the entire strategy for the remaining campaigns across the Central Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. The men who would storm those beaches represented the finest that America could produce. Marines who had volunteered to serve their country in its hour of greatest need, who had trained relentlessly for the challenges they now faced, and who carried with them the hopes and prayers of a nation locked in a struggle for survival against totalitarian enemies on two sides of the globe. As their landing craft and amphibian tractors churned through the lagoon waters toward their designated beaches, these Marines embodied everything that was best about the American spirit: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, determination to complete their mission regardless of the cost, and an unshakable faith in their cause and in each other. The Battle of Tarawa was about to begin, and nothing would ever be quite the same again for amphibious warfare in the Pacific. The lessons learned in blood on those coral beaches would save countless lives in future operations, and the courage displayed by both attackers and defenders would stand as an eternal testament to the warrior spirit that drives men to extraordinary acts of heroism when everything they hold dear hangs in the balance. In the space of 76 hours, a forgotten atoll in the Central Pacific would become one of the most famous battlefields in military history, and the men who fought there would earn their place among the greatest warriors who ever lived. Their sacrifice would not be in vain, for it would help forge the victory that would restore freedom and democracy to the Pacific and ensure that future generations could live in peace. The thunder of guns was about to begin in earnest, and when it finally ended, the world would remember Tarawa not as an obscure dot on the map, but as the place where ordinary men accomplished extraordinary things in the service of liberty and justice. The 76 hours that changed history were about to unfold, and every man involved understood that he was participating in something far greater than himself, a struggle that would determine the fate of nations and the future of human freedom across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean.